Great. Thank you so much for the invitation, for the introduction, and really I want to just get into a conversation. So I'm going to keep my opening remarks really brief. I'm really excited to be here with my friend Earl Carr, and I want to congratulate him on writing a really important book. It couldn't be more important, and it couldn't be more timely. And I appreciate that it's a book that's looking at the long arc of the U.S.-China relationship, and it's thinking not only about the current context with the Biden-Harris administration, but also with the previous administration, looking at continuities in policies, discontinuities in policies. And I think one point that we can all agree on, regardless of what our preferred prescriptions are for U.S.-China policy, is that managing China's resurgence is going to be one of the foremost tasks of U.S. foreign policy, if not the foremost task of U.S. foreign policy. It is going to be a bipartisan undertaking. It is going to require creativity from every corner. And so I think that Earl has written a really supremely important book. And so I want to say, Earl, just congratulations to you. And maybe just to kick us off, maybe walk us through what was sort of the immediate precipitant, if there was an immediate precipitant for you writing the book, or was this a thought that had kind of been percolating in your mind for some time? So what led you to write the book? What do you think are the takeaways that you want both academics and policymakers to glean from your work and from the essays that you've assembled, and then we'll go from there. But Earl, over to you.
Wonderful. First and foremost, Ali, thank you so much for the extraordinary, kind introduction. I've been a huge fan of your work for quite some time, and I remember not too long after writing my book, you tweeted my book out, as well as a very kind note that Elizabeth Economy had written. So I wanted to thank you very much for that. I also would like to extend a very special thanks to Aisha Castleberry-Hernandez for inviting me and for starting such an extraordinary organization, DIN, the Security Network, and hope that in the future, both organizations like ICAP can also form joint programs with DINS. I think there's as my mentor, Ambassador Gina Winstanley would always say, Earl, remember, there is strength in numbers. So I would also like to say a special thanks to Rob and all the people who put time and effort to make this event possible. These things don't just happen. There's a lot of work and effort. So special thanks. As I start, I'm cognizant that Chinese New Year is just wrapping up, and so a very special Happy New Year to everyone. I'm also cognizant that we begin also Black History Month as well, and then given that my father is Black from Jamaica and my mother is Chinese, and in true Blasian form, we would say once you go Blasian, you've got the magic equation. To answer your question, Ali, how did this book come about? And if I could tell a story, I think it would best illustrate that. So it was in the third grade. My father came to pick me up from school, and I was really excited. It was the first day at my dad. I hadn't seen him all day, and my father didn't meet my teachers in the beginning. So, in the beginning of school. And so I'm wrapping up and I see my father, and I'm really excited. He's coming at the door. My father is 6'2", tall Black man who formerly served as a Jamaican ambassador to China. My teacher at the time is a 4 foot, about 8-inch Caucasian nun. And I am the only Asian looking kid in the class. So just keep that in mind. So as my father approaches the door, my teacher leaves the class with a little bit of trepidation as she sees this tall Black man at the door. She with a bit of trepidation, opens the door and she says, "Sir, can I help you?" I'm pretty excited. I'm seeing Dad, and I'm packing up, and then my father turns to my teacher and says, "Good afternoon. I'm here to pick up my son." My teacher looks at my father. She looks back at the class. As I mentioned, I'm the only Asian looking kid in the class. And she says to my father, "Sir, I'm sorry, I think you got the wrong class." I'm looking at my dad. My dad is looking at me, don't exactly know what's going to transpire. And my father, without missing a beat, leans into the teacher, looks at her in the face and says with unwavering confidence, "Ma'am, I know who my son is." So I'm watching this as a third grader. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I was different. I realized that because of the color, because of how my dad looked as a Black man, because of how I looked as relatively Asian, my teacher could not discern that I was related to my father. And in hindsight, as I reflect on that period, race should and can never define our character, but they often impact perceptions. And it was amongst this backdrop that I wrote this book in many ways to help combat the notion of China as this existential threat, and to help provide a more nuanced and more informed view of China. In many different ways, China has when you look at the historic characteristics that have defined U.S.-China relations over the last, since forming of diplomatic relations, it has always been defined by cooperation as well as competition. But when we focus too much on the competition and we neglect the cooperation, we do a huge disservice not only to our American business people who are operating in China, we do a huge disservice to our American farmers in the Midwest that get caught up in a trade war and they see their products get impacted in terms of tariffs. We do a huge disservice to both American students studying abroad in China as well as Chinese students studying in the United States. And so as I was analyzing and looking at relations over the last few decades, I felt that there was an important need to be able to address this lack of understanding between the U.S. and China during this incredible inflection point.
Earl, thank you. So, just echoing the comment in the chat, you learn something new every day, and even though we've been friends for some time, and we've exchanged a lot of messages over email and over Twitter, I had no idea, and I really appreciate. I was expecting that you were going to go in one direction, and I'm actually really glad that you kind of gave us an origin story. I was expecting that you would kind of sort of dive right into the strategic lessons from the book, the geopolitical lessons from the book, and I'm sure that we in due course will get to those lessons. But I think it's really important that you begin with that origin story. I didn't know that, but it's such a powerful story, and it's interesting actually that you begin. I don't know if you did so intentionally, but it makes me think that in much the same way that individuals often look upon one another with suspicion. They have certain misapprehensions, they have certain misjudgments. I think that the same kinds of suspicions or the same kind of distance that often informs relations between individuals often carries up to the level of governments, to the level of the nation state. And it's become something of a trope to talk about the imperative of people-to-people exchanges, of cultural exchanges, of diplomatic exchanges. But I don't think that it's any less true or any less persuasive for being a trope. And I think that the past roughly 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic have placed in very, very stark relief how critical that diplomacy is. And not only how critical people-to-people exchanges are and in-person diplomacy is, but also what the consequences are when that in-person interaction is absent. And I don't want to be overly sanguine. I certainly wouldn't suggest that if we were to have regular people-to-people exchanges and regular diplomatic exchanges in person, that the United States and China would be able to mitigate all of their strategic distrust. They would meet each other halfway. But there is something just inherently humanizing about sitting across from someone and looking at them in the eye. And I think that in-person communication has really been lost in large measure due to COVID. So I appreciate your beginning with that opening story, that origin story. I think it really maps out onto a relationship. So you talked about in your own personal life, this certain misapprehensions, certain suppositions that your teacher had about your father. And I think that similarly thinking about, and so maybe then this is sort of the question that you kind of led me into, even though this isn't the question that I was planning to ask, but I think I feel compelled to. So you talk in your origin story about how two important individuals in your life. Obviously, your father, your grade school teacher, how your teacher had certain misapprehensions about your father, reached certain premature conclusions, and how those premature conclusions undermine trust, undermine communication. Take that lesson now to the level of the nation state, and sort of the topic that we're talking about here. So the relationship between the United States and China. Obviously, in recent years, the relationship has gone from one of competitive coexistence, and maybe it's still defined by competitive coexistence, but I think it's increasingly strained. Do you think that if U.S. diplomats and Chinese diplomats were to sit together more regularly, do you think that they would be able to find certain areas of common ground? Is cooperation kind of an illusion, a relic of a past era? But imagine now, so let's imagine that in-person diplomacy is on a regular basis is possible again, and you have delegation from China meeting together. How does that conversation start? Where should the two sides start? What types of misgivings or misapprehensions might they have about one another, and how might they break the ice a little bit and get started back on a path towards more regularized diplomacy?
Ali, it's a great question. Thanks so much for posing it. You know, when senior policymakers like Kurt Campbell argue that engagement is dead, I reject those notions, because engagement with China or any country should never be dead. We should always be engaging with countries like China, particularly as the two most important bilateral relations in the world. I think in many ways, I think of the story of US President Ronald Reagan when he met with then Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. And it's a famous story where they are walking outside and they did something that was pretty unique. Ronald Reagan asked if the two of them could just go outside with just their interpreters. And so just the four of them are outside, and Ronald Reagan turns to Mikhail Gorbachev and says, if Martians were to come to Earth and attack us, attack the United States, would Russia come to our defense? And Mikhail Gorbachev laughed and then looked Ronald Reagan in the eyes and said, we would. And then Mikhail Gorbachev asked the same question to Ronald Reagan, said, you know, if Martians were to come to Earth and attack Russia, would the United States defend Russia? And Ronald Reagan smiled and looked him in the face and said, yes. And what's fascinating is that if you look, that quintessential moment redefined their relationship throughout the end of the Cold War. And if you look at the pinnacle of the Cold War, the United States and Russia could not decide who should have nuclear weapons, but they did decide on how to eradicate polio. And so you saw for one of the first times the United States and US scientists working together cooperatively with scientists from Russia, and they were along in the United Nations, and they were able to solve the issue of and eradicate polio as a disease. And it just strikes me that when we have a common purpose and a common vision, what we can achieve in terms of humanity. And I think that diplomats being able to, whether it be with China and the United States, sitting down, when you look someone in the face and work with them with a common purpose and a common vision, I think that there's so many notions that we do have common goals and objectives. And I think that's what's missing currently. And so, that's how I would respond to your question.
I love this. I love this story, and I appreciate your bringing it sort of back to all of our attention, sort of the alien test or the Martian test. If Martians were to attack, or I guess Martians are kind of a metaphor. If some crisis were to intrude, would we come to each other's defense? And let's take. There are multiple crises, multiple global crises, but let's take the kind of the proverbial Martian test of our time, namely the coronavirus pandemic, and sort of help us sort of understand how what one would have thought intuitively would have been kind of a galvanizing moment for the two countries to at least compartmentalize competitive dynamics, and a moment for emergency coordination, and how that cooperation that we hope would materialize did. And the example that the parallel, and it's not really a parallel because it didn't end up working out that way, but the antecedent that I think of is the global financial crisis. So Lehman Brothers collapses, and the United States and China in late 2008, early 2009, the relationship was becoming more strained. There was certainly a feeling in certain quarters in the United States that China, it wasn't a peer competitor, but it was no longer just another member of the BRICS. It was kind of an emerging power in a class of its own. So there was certainly growing suspicion, and the relationship, I think, was getting more strained. And yet, when Lehman Brothers collapsed and there was a mutual recognition that what was then a fast-moving recession left unchecked could morph into another Great Depression, you did see this emergency bilateral cooperation between the United States and China, which Dan Dresner talks about in his book, That the System Worked. Washington and Beijing, they activated the G20. And so again, 2008 and 2009, particularly 2009, they were brutal years for the global economy, but they could have been a lot worse. And I'll betray perhaps a certain naivete on my part. When the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic on March 11th, 2020, so it's hard to believe, almost approaching 2 years ago, instinctively I thought, okay, now, given the gravity of that declaration, certainly the world's two foremost powers, they're going to engage in comparable emergency coordination. They're going to activate international institutions in much the same way that they did in late 2008 and early 2009. Not only did we not see that activation, what we've seen is that kind of this demarcation. I think that historians a generation or two generations hence are going to look back on COVID-19 as being an inflection point or sort of a threshold. And really, the bottom has just really fell out from under the relationship after the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. So when you compare these two Martian invasions or alien invasions, so global financial crisis 2008, 2009, coronavirus pandemic in 2020, why were the bilateral responses different? Why was the relationship able to weather the global financial crisis, and why did the pandemic prove to have not only to not lift up the relationship, but actually to really take the floor under it? Kind of help us unpack the differences between those two systemic shocks.
No, it's great. And I think it's so critically important to understand that during the financial crisis, China and the United States, even 2008 was a great example of that. The United States and China worked cooperatively together, coordinated economic policy in many different ways. But there's a quintessential lesson learned from the 2008 financial crisis that had a huge impact on China's perception of the United States. When I went to China to work, first study in 1998, and then later to work in first consulting at McKinsey, and then I later worked in banking at HSBC Bank in Shanghai. China regarded foreign expertise in banking, foreign talent as kind of being like the holy grail. There was this perception that they really needed and wanted and desired to have foreign technology, expertise, expats, etc. But when the financial crisis hit, Wang Qishan, the one of the members of the Chinese Standing Politburo, he said a very famous comment to U.S. Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Paulson at the time. He said, the teacher is not looking so great anymore. Meaning that the United States, who we looked up to as this great superpower, when they handled the economic crisis the way that they did, it had a huge credibility. The United States had a huge credibility deficit after that. And I think in many ways, when you look at the COVID crisis, China in many ways is looking to be able to assert leadership because of that credibility deficit after the financial crisis. So I think the perception of the United States as kind of being able to China to be viewed as more of an equal partner and assert itself on the international scale in many ways compromised or had a huge impact in the United States and China being able to cooperate. I think also when you look at the origins of COVID, right, and that also really compacted and really impacted how the United States and China cooperated. You know, the way China and officials handled COVID early on was not upright and honest about how it transpired. And I think that there were a lot of factors that impacted that cooperation as well. I think another critical issue that is important to realize is that, Chairman, Xi Jinping believes he's a man in a rush. He believes that within the next 10 to 12 years, he can fundamentally alter the global order more in China's favor. And as a result of that, of those notions and those goals and objectives, that also has a huge impact on how China wants and aims to both cooperate and compete with the United States.
No, thanks so much. I mean, there's so many threads that I want to unpack. And I should say, actually, I just, given how excited I am about this topic, I could go on. I want to make sure. So, Asha, please just cut me off or let me know when we should open up to questions. I want to make sure that I'm not kind of domineering the conversation. So just cut me off or signal to me, and I'll stop. So we can open to questions. But Earl, I want to unpack a few threads in your answer just now, and one of them, you characterize Xi Jinping as being kind of a man in a rush. Something I've been struck by, and you would be far more familiar with this discourse than I am, but I've been struck that it's a discourse that I've found to be more prominent sort of in recent months and recent years than, say, 5 years or 10 years ago. I've been struck by conflicting assessments, not only of China's trajectory, but conflicting assessments of America's trajectory. I see some in the United States. You have, well, I don't want to be overly reductionist, but I'm just for simplicity's sake, you have one strain of argumentation, which I think is kind of a more long-standing strain, which says that the United States has more to fear on account of China's resurgence, has more to fear on account of the possibility that China will go from strength to strength, that its aggregate power will increase, therefore its aggregate power and therefore its aggregate influence will increase. So there's one strain of commentary that says the United States needs to be fearful of a resurgent China and a continuously resurgent China. I've started seeing them more and more, and I wouldn't say that the adherents to this kind of counter narrative are sort of the center of analytical gravity, but I think that they're becoming more prominent, and they come to mind because of your notion of sort of Xi Jinping being a man in a rush. You are starting to now see more commentary, again, not sort of the majoritarian strain in U.S. commentary, but it's increasingly pronounced, that says the United States doesn't need to fear over the long term a resurgent China. It needs to fear a China that's in a rush. It needs to fear a China that feels that its window of opportunity for achieving certain core interests is diminishing, and that over the long term, the United States actually has more to fear from a structurally or systemically declining China. And it harkens back to an observation that President Clinton made. He says that a lot of people worry about a rising or resurgent China, but we also need to be cognizant and alive to the risks of a weak China. And so there's several dimensions I would love for you to unpack. So when you assess China's trajectory, do you see China as going from strength to strength, or do you see China as being on the precipice of systemic decline? Do you think that China believes that its time horizon is sizable and expanding, or do you believe that China assesses its time horizon to be narrow and shrinking? What should the United States be more fearful of? And if you were you call it Xi Jinping a man in a rush, if you were to psychoanalyze him a little bit, what is your sense? Do you think that he is increasingly confident about China's position in the world? Is he increasingly insecure? Are confidence and insecurity maybe two sides of the same coin? So lots of threads, lots of questions, but just your notion of Xi Jinping as a man in a rush, it really, I wanted to get into this temporal dimension of China's trajectory, how it assesses itself, but unpack that temporal dimension a little bit. I'd be really, really fascinated to hear your thoughts.
Sure, and thanks for once again another great question. When I assess the trajectory of China's power, I think that there is a growing assertiveness that China believes that their time has come, their time has arrived. And if you look at the previous leaders, Deng Xiaoping, Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, all of them had, certain levels of marks that they wanted to make in history. Hu Jintao was always, regarded as kind of slow and steady. He had certain goals and objectives of how he wanted to transform the bureaucracy. But if you look at the way President Xi has been able to consolidate power in such a short amount of time, and the overwhelming emphasis has been on economic growth and development. I say a man in haste because for the next, like I said, 10 to 12 years, there's an overwhelmingly, there's a sense that she wants to really define certain goals. And I think one example of that, I would say, is the issue of Taiwan. And I'll calibrate it within the context of he's a man in a rush because he understands that although he is the top dog, let's be very clear. I was saying, he's a man with extraordinary ambition, but ambition is different from execution. And so if we're just to take the quintessential issue of Taiwan, and I think Taiwan is important because if there's any kind of military conflict that could arise in the next foreseeable future, I believe it will be over the issue of Taiwan. And so why is he in a rush? If you look at the next emerging leaders of China, when I speak to the elite of the elite in China, those who have been educated in the United States and are back in China being primed for the next, important roles in the next few decades, there is this notion that for their entire life, they've grown up and they've seen Taiwan as being separate from the mainland, right? It's almost like, if I could use when I heard Prime Minister Modi speak for the first time at the Council on Foreign Relations, he said, me and my generation are the first generation that were born and tasted freedom from colonialism, British colonialism. And once you let the genie out of the bottle, there's no going back. And so I say he's a man in a rush because if you look at the next generation of leaders, he fundamentally understands that they will not look at the issue of Taiwan the same way that he and his generation looks at these issues. And so as a result, there's this notion of control. What is it that I can control? What can I do that President Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, all of those leaders can do? And that is being able to reunite Taiwan with the mainland. So there is this urge, there is this pressure, there's this ability to be able to affect change in a way that he wants to be able to affect change. Now, once again, I think the deterrent to that is the fact that can the United States, along with its allies, when you look at ANCUS, when you look at the Quad, can they provide a credible deterrence whereby which, China is able to rethink that strategic calculus in the future? And so I think that the jury is still out on that one, but I just wanted to unpack some of the dynamics and use Taiwan as an example to respond to your question.
Yeah, and there's another thread that I want to unpack there, and I kind of trying to sort of get at sort of the essence of competition between the United States and China, and getting a sense of sort of what are America's competitive strengths along with those of its core allies and partners, and what are China's main competitive strengths and liabilities. So you mentioned AUKUS, you mentioned the Quad, and it seems that in the first year of the Biden-Harris administration, I think that the United States and its allies and partners, they've made a tremendous amount of progress in terms of consolidating their Indo-Pacific presence along a number of dimensions. So militarily, certainly, with, as you mentioned, with AUKUS, there does seem to be now in earnest a rebalance of military assets to the Indo-Pacific. You look at the growing prominence of the Quad. You look at the proliferation of bilateral and multilateral agreements under the auspices of the Quad, such as the reciprocal access agreement between Japan and Australia. You look at supply chain and technology cooperation between the Quad countries. So certainly, you look at sort of military influence in the Indo-Pacific, diplomatic influence, technological influence in the Indo-Pacific, and I think there there's been a lot of progress that the administration has made. It seems that this year the emphasis is going to be, I shouldn't say the emphasis, but I think more of an emphasis alongside the continuation of military, diplomatic, and technological engagement is going to be shoring up America's economic staying power. And I think that many of America's allies and partners fear that absent a more forceful articulation of an affirmative economic vision for the Indo-Pacific, there's a fear that the balance of power could continue tilting in China's favor. And China, on the other hand, it does seem that outside of its relationship with Russia, which continues to deepen apace, and I'd love to actually sort of come to China-Russia in a little bit, but outside of its relationship with Russia, it seems that many of China's relationships with major powers are either stagnating or are, in some cases, in decline. But even though China finds itself perhaps more diplomatically estranged from advanced industrial democracies, economically it continues marching along. And I think that at least if you look at most of the economic data points, whether it's exports, it's foreign direct investment in the mainland, I think by many metrics, China is actually more central to the global economy now than it was prior to the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. So if I were doing just kind of a quick balance sheet for the United States and China, so I think for the United States and its allies and partners, militarily, diplomatically, and technologically, I think that they're making a lot of progress, not in presenting some kind of unified coalition to contain China, but in selectively contesting China. And I think that China, on the other hand, I think that it has not only growing economic heft and technological capacity, but it has a certain narrative momentum that I think flows from that. And I think that when China says that or conveys that now is our time, I think that they can point to their economic performance to support that assertion. So I look at China, its main strengths being economic centrality and the narrative momentum that generates. I look at the United States and its allies and partners and see military, diplomatic, and technological influence, perhaps not as much on the economic side. What does your balance sheet look like? So if you were doing kind of a quick net assessment of the United States' competitive strengths and weaknesses, ditto for China, what would your balance sheet look like?
Yeah. I think inherent in your question is this notion of parity, right? China has always looked at parity with the United States, not only for legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, but more importantly, for the modernization of China's economic development. You saw this parity, particularly in the 1960s, with China striving to be in terms of weapons and nuclear weapons in particular. And you saw this parity in the 1980s with China striving to get access into the World Trade Organization. And now you are seeing this parity playing out in 5G, big data. When I went to China for the first time in 1998, I studied at Beijing Normal University. I was one of 20 foreign students in a foreign dormitory. And I had to wait an hour to use one phone. There was one phone for 20 of us, and this was the phone where, you press buttons, if you remember those. And so I waited for an hour to call my sister who had just given birth to my little nephew, and I heard his voice for the first time. 20 years later, I'm on a high-speed rail train working in Shanghai. I'm using the Wi-Fi of the high-speed rail to get behind the Chinese firewall. And I'm using a phone that is being manufactured in the millions throughout multiple provinces throughout China. And inherent in your question, Ali, is this notion of parity. And if I, to use your question on the balance sheet, I think that, 5G and technological prowess with respect to, economic dominance, that will be the defining feature in the future. MIT put out a great report that looked at just patents, right? For inventions. From inception until last year, China has filed 80,000 inventions. If you look at the United States, since inception, we have filed 30,000 patents for inventions. That's something telling if you look at the contrast just in a short amount of time. So I think the critical focus will be our economic strategy, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, and developing that economic framework with developing countries such as Vietnam, such as Indonesia, and being able to And here's the critical thing: be able to provide market access to these countries in a way that can develop their economies, but at the same token, be able to cooperate on things like green technology, free trade agreements. And so that will be the defining architecture for the foreseeable future. On China's side, I think the reality is, look, China realizes that you're never going to beat China one-on-one. China has assumed they are winning the race in 5G. Let's just call it what it is. But as my mentor says, the race is not over. And so it's critically important that when you look at the comparative advantages, the United States has to be able to confront China from a multilateral framework.
I really like this notion of kind of a sort of a multi-dimensional approach, and I think that, well, there's several elements in what you said. One, this notion of sort of a multi-dimensional approach to China, and I would just to sort of to offer kind of my 2 cents, I would say that the more that approach, I think, is affirmative in nature. So, what is America's affirmative vision for the Indo-Pacific? A vision for the Indo-Pacific that will certainly be informed by China's resurgence, but isn't beholden to that phenomena, isn't dictated by that phenomena. So what is a proactive, affirmative, I think critically economic vision for the region look like? I think that component is important. And also in terms of multidimensionality, what can the United States do? What can the United States do to renew its own unique competitive advantages, of which I think that there are many, and I think that some of those advantages are singular. So what can the United States do to renew its advantages at home and abroad? So I wanted to unpack a couple of threads in what you just said. So so the first thing you said, and again, this story that really just resonated with me. You talked about kind of what a difference 20 years makes, and I suspect it's not only that China's resurgence has taken many of China's neighbors by surprise, has taken the international community by surprise. I would have to guess that it probably has taken even China's own leaders by surprise. I remember actually I was rereading this essay at the turn of the 20th century. There was an article that was published in Foreign Affairs magazine, and it was published by the then director of studies at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And I think that the title of the essay was "Does China Matter?" It was something very, very pithy. But, does China? I think it was called "Does China Matter?" And so it was published in 1999. And now, in retrospect, sitting here in 2022, a lot of people would scoff and say, well, how on earth could someone write such a preposterous piece? But at the time, in 1999, if you read the essay, and I had occasion to reread it the other day, he makes a very compelling case. It was a contentious case, and his essay elicited a very strong debate, but it was a very plausible case at the time. When you look at sort of relative, you think about where China is now, and if you think about where China was at the turn of the century. So where was China in 1999? I mean, certainly economically was nowhere near where it is now. It was diplomatically, I think, still trying to kind of, it was still feeling kind of some of the aftershocks from the fallout from the crackdown at Tiananmen Square. It was still trying to find its way to sort of insert itself into post-war international institutions. And obviously, this was only a few years after the Taiwan Strait crisis of 95, 96. So China's military modernization, at least the current wave, had only really just begun. So China in 1999, you could say, does China really matter? And now, of course, it's now emerged as America's principal competitor. So just one, I guess, kind of reaction is, I think that China's resurgence would have been somewhat disorienting to the United States, regardless of the time frame over which it had elapsed. But I think the fact that it has occurred in such a compressed time fashion really makes it that much more jarring. And so that leads me then to the question that I want to ask. So we've been hearing a lot in recent months, in recent years, notions of competitive coexistence between the United States and China, durable cohabitation. Are we in a new Cold War? And so I want to ask, the United States views China as its principal challenger. China views the United States as the principal challenger to its continued resurgence. Is competitive coexistence possible? If it is, and I certainly hope the answer is yes, what would the pillars of competitive coexistence be? What do the United States and China need to do to get there? And then so that's question one. And then second question I want to ask, since we were talking about history, you talked about your own sort of history of sort of seeing how, how rapidly China's evolved. It's the 50-year anniversary of President Nixon's visit to China, and there's a lot of relitigating, understandably a lot of relitigating. Was the United States right or wrong to initiate its opening to China? Should the United States have adopted an alternative course of policy vis-a-vis China? Did we get China wrong? Did we make certain mistakes? Could we have taken a different course that would have, if not entirely averted the competitive challenge that China poses, at least somewhat dulled it? And so two questions. So one, what does competitive coexistence look like, assuming that it's possible? And then two, kind of take us sort of on a half-century kind of history tour and tell us, if you could think of it counterfactually, did we get China wrong?
Yeah. Great questions. I put a copy of the link of our book in, and in the book we talk a lot about the importance of not only just being able to coexist with China, but being able to fundamentally find ways to both compete, thrive, and push back at the same time on important fundamental notions of values and systems. There is no such thing as fundamental core decoupling between our two economies. Let's just get that straight. When people say, the United States and China are going to decouple their economies, there is no such thing, because both the United States and China understands that if to fundamentally decouple our economies would be catastrophic, both for China's economy and for the United States economy. I think what we are seeing is targeted decoupling, right? Particularly in areas and sectors that are highly sensitive from a national security standpoint. So I think it's critically important that we understand that rubric within the framework of coexistence. I think it's also critically important that we understand within coexistence, there should be boundaries. And what I mean by that is that when we have sectors of our government argue that we should be bringing about regime change within China, these are counterproductive to our diplomatic efforts and a smack in the face to our diplomats. I mean, when the CIA and other elements within our government talk openly about regime change, I mean, this is fundamentally, I think, a misuse of American taxpayer dollars, resources, etc. Look, I understand that the CIA will play a role in U.S. foreign policy. Spying has always existed and will continue to exist. But I think we have to be able to fundamentally confront elements within our foreign policy that just are not going to be practical vis-a-vis countries like China. We would not want to engage with China if they were to say elements like, hey, look, we're openly, we want to bring about the end of your elected officials within government. That would not go down well with our diplomats, with our system of governments. And so I think it's really important that we understand and draw boundaries around what foreign policy tools are effective and what foreign policy tools are not effective with respect to the framework of coexistence, number one. With respect to number two, did we get China wrong? I think there's a growing notion that when China was accepted into the World Trade Organization, that China would embrace a level of change from a governance structure. And that exactly did not pan out. I remember in grad school reading all these papers that, when an economy reaches a certain level of GDP per capita, they will inherently become a democracy. And that just did not play out. And we got that flat wrong. We just got to call a spade a spade. We didn't get that right. And so in many ways, a Harvard professor mentioned that if he were to be asked what surprised him about China's economic system, China's system, he said, I didn't realize how creative socialism could be. And so I think that in many different ways, that rings true of how kind of innovative China has been able to be in terms of its economic, political, and social system.
So I think we're going until 8 o'clock. So I'm going to stop. At around maybe 7:30. I really want to make sure that we get to questions from from folks who are attending. So, please, raise your hand or put your questions in the chat box, and I want to make sure that we get to as many of them as we can. So I'll plan on stopping at around 7:30, and then we can go from there to questions from all of you. So you talked about boundaries, and you talked about sort of boundaries to circumscribe competition, and you talked about kind of certain areas or certain notions that you think should be sort of off limits for for the United States. And let's kind of now flip the script. We've talked a fair bit about sort of U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis China, perhaps certain U.S. misapprehensions about China. If you were kind of a counselor to President Xi, and you were saying, here are certain notions that you should disabuse yourself of vis-a-vis the United States. Here are certain policies that you should either temper or stop altogether vis-a-vis the United States. Here are ways in which you could make your foreign policy more productive, sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of flip the script a little bit and talk about what you might say, what counsel you might offer, and then I have one more question, and then maybe we can go to questions and answers from everyone in attendance.
It's a great question. I would say I would have a number of three core strategic priorities. But the more fundamental question is she open to listening? I think that's the more critical question. And when you have someone who let me start with the prescription first, my recommendations, and I'll get into the latter question of why I said, would he be open to listening? Number one, I think first, there's so much potential for the United States and China to work cooperatively, particularly in the areas of the environment. I was speaking to an American government official, and he was ranting and raving about, why should any business, any American consumers be investing in China's economy when you look at China's flagrant human rights violations in Xinjiang and what's going on in Hong Kong. And I turned to him and I said, well, let's just take climate change, for example, and looking at ways of investment. So there's a fund called Crane Shares Decarbonization Fund. It has about 1.6 billion in assets under management. And the vast majority of investors have been American or American Chinese living in the United States. The fund has done phenomenally well. It's up about 60% since inception. And when you look at a fund that helps to promote the decarbonization footprint in China, and you tie that into, well, you look at the air pollution of China and how, if you look at the coastal areas of China, how some of the air pollution has been well documented to actually go across the Pacific and impact parts of California. It makes a win-win situation that by investing in the decarbonization of China, you are fundamentally investing in the decarbonization imprint in the United States. And so when you frame it in that context, you can see how, and this goes back to the Martian story, like if we can share common adversaries, this is a great example of how the United States and China can and should cooperate. And so I would state that number one to President Xi. Number two, I would say that we have to understand and recognize that in the era of mutual assured destruction, or MAD, that any miscalculation over Taiwan, miscalculation over in the South China Sea would be catastrophic for China, and it would set China back decades. And it would cause a catastrophic loss of life that we have not seen since World War I or World War II. And so I think it's important that we define expectations, and let's show our cards, right? Like, we both understand that we can't afford any kind of military conflict, and let's adhere to agree on those seminal principles. Number three, I would say that there are in terms of educational exchanges, that these should continue. If you look at the number of American students that study in China, it's about roughly 10,000 American students last year, according to the International Education, IIE. And unfortunately, that number has been declining over the years. There are roughly 290,000 Chinese students that study in the United States. And I think that reciprocal educational programs, study abroad, help to promote more understanding, mutual understanding between different cultures, different languages, different ideas. And we should commit to upholding those exchanges. So those are the three that I would articulate to President Xi. Now, when I say whether or not he would be open to listening is something different. Because if you look at the trajectory of some of the changes and policies that he has made, he's created an environment where opposition is not particularly espoused or encouraged. A. B, when you factor in the fact that he has essentially made himself president for life by taking away term limits, he has unraveled the systems of governance that Mao, Chairman Mao, Deng Xiaoping, these leaders put in place because they understood the perils of having a dictatorial leader. And so I think that this is a very dangerous position where you have someone like President Xi, who is essentially deconstructing so many of the progress that President Deng Xiaoping, Chairman Deng Xiaoping, had done for the last 20 years from an economic standpoint. And so that's how I would frame that second question.
That's really, really compelling, and it is remarkable to. It's remarkable to think when someone essentially says, I am now, the leader for life, or sort of leader indefinitely, and to be the leader indefinitely of a country of China's proportions, by definition, but sort of intrinsically, it has global ramifications. China, population of 1.4 billion, it has the world's second largest economy. So that type of decision to say, I am now sort of ruler for life, or at least ruler indefinitely, it has huge implications. I'm going to ask one last question because I know we're coming up on 7:30. I think we're going to 8. So let me ask one last question, and then I really think that we should open it up. So you mentioned Taiwan, and you said that the most likely flashpoint in the U.S.-China relationship, the one that certainly would entail the highest risk of a military confrontation, would be Taiwan. I do want to bring Russia into the conversation. So obviously, right now, I think sort of the most pressing concern for many observers is a possibility of a Russian attack on Ukraine. You look at the ongoing mobilization of Russian troops. You look at a flurry of diplomatic efforts that, I don't know if I would say that they've reached a complete impasse, but they don't seem to be producing breakthroughs. They seem to essentially be holding the current situation or putting it in a holding pattern. So there's a lot of concern, and there's a concern that if Russia were to attack Ukraine, that the United States and its allies and partners would become distracted. China might have this window of opportunity in which Xi Jinping, being a man in haste, would say, I now have this window of opportunity to make a move on Taiwan. Talk a little bit about what you think the linkages are, if any. What are the linkages between Russian calculus vis-a-vis Ukraine and China's calculus vis-a-vis Taiwan? Do you think there are any linkages between those two phenomenon? If so, what are they? And then maybe just sort of taking a broader aperture, what is your just kind of net assessment of the China-Russia relationship? So is it, if you look at their joint statement of a few days ago, does this joint statement inaugurate a new sort of alternative world order? Does it kind of consecrate a de facto alliance between China and Russia? Is it an axis of convenience? So talk a little bit about the linkage between sort of the pressing crisis, namely Russia-Ukraine, with another sort of simmering dynamic, China and Taiwan. Talk about the linkages, and then help us understand the China-Russia relationship. How would you distill its essence? And then really, I would love to go to questions from folks in the audience.
Sure. Once again, another great question. And I think the Wall Street Journal did a great piece on this 2 days ago, which talked about, the critical symbolic importance of the joint Russia-China statement. And I think that you're seeing a stronger relationship between Russia and China, in part due to the strategic alliances that the United States and its allies have presented, particularly as we had mentioned with ANKUS, particularly as we mentioned the Quad, and thus there is increasing pressure for China to develop and forge similar like alliances, multilateral arrangements with its strongest allies and neighbors, if you will. On the issue of Ukraine, I think it's really interesting that when you look at the massive amount of troops that Russia has assembled on the border, if Russia were to invade, I think the harder part, and I think the Ukraine defense ministers put this best, eloquently, is that, to be able to secure the landmass accurately of such a large country is extremely, extremely challenging. And when I see Ukrainian mothers training with their teenage sons how to prevent and fight back, it reminds, when I watched a telling show, one of the reporters said, are you willing to die for your country? And the woman with her sons by her side said, look, we're all going to die one day. The most important thing is how do you live before you die? And this is something that I'm worth, and I will give everything that I will give everything that I have to fight for my country. When you see that kind of determination, that kind of drive for people that are willing to defend their land and their, it recalls messages of kind of, Vietnam, and, the United States were far superior in terms of their technological advances and soldiers and might of army. But at some point, they lost the vision of why they were there, right? The Vietnamese knew why they were fighting. They knew, and they knew what they were prepared to do to defend their country. And so I think it's important that we understand that dynamic and how that could play out in any kind of military conflict. To get back to your original question in terms of Russia and China, I think that relationship has also been framed by both cooperation and competition. They have competed historically in Central Asia for influence over countries like Kazakhstan and elsewhere. And so I think in many ways, this is more of a relationship of convenience given where we are in this geopolitical inflection point. The reality is that Russia needs to rely more economically on Europe, but given where we are geopolitically, they have to rely and lean more on China, which may not necessarily bode well long-term economically for Russia's economy. But this is kind of where we are.
Earl, thank you so much. This was just such a, in an hour, it was just such a tour de force. I've been just frantically jotting down notes the entire time. You really, we covered so many topics. Just thank you so much for giving us a real kind of a panoramic view of the U.S.-China relationship, where the United States and China will compete, where they might yet cooperate, and then certainly bringing in current events with Russia, Ukraine. So I want to pass the baton. I realize we have about half an hour left, and I want to kick it over to questions. So I was going to say, Asha, since you made this event happen, and we're so generous in extending the invitation, I wonder if you wanted to kick off, since you so graciously gave us the opportunity, and also just maybe you're given your perspective as a senior official in the Biden-Harris administration, kind of how you see the competitive challenge from China, what your reactions were to Earl's comments. But Asha, do you want to sort of kick us off, and then we can get some more questions?
I'll say something real quick. Yes, thank you, Ali. My words and anything like that doesn't reflect the U.S. government, but I do have a question to ask with regards to Chinese history and patterns. So I was told that in order to learn about China in the 21st century, you have to look at their history. And sometimes you see repeated the same type of behavior what you see in the past. So Earl, or Ali, or definitely Earl, do you see any trends that you've seen in the past, and how it helps us understand modern China now?
Great question. And Ali, feel free to jump in. I would say two things. One, I put a link in the chat, and the link is from a recent speech that George Soros gave at the Hoover Institution on China, U.S.-China relations. And when you listen, I encourage everyone to listen to the speech, because it frames the historical perspective on China, analyzing China historically vis-a-vis China today. And I think, everyone draws parallels between President Xi and Chairman Mao in terms of power struggles and power dynamics. And if you look historically at Chairman Mao was willing to essentially destroy the party and not work through the bureaucracy at all, particularly when you look at, things like the Daiyuejin, the Great Leap Forward, or the Cultural Revolution, where he persecuted, that many people within the Chinese Communist Party. If you look at President Xi understands that he needs to fundamentally work through the party and the bureaucracy in order to achieve his fundamental short, mid, and long-term objectives. Those are fundamentally two contrasting things, but from a historical perspective, that are very different between the two leaders currently. But what we have seen, and I come back to this because it's really important, that when you look at how President Xi is running and defining strategy within China, he really believes in the communist ideology. When you look at some of the policies that he has implemented that really has taken China back in so many ways from the huge strides of Deng Xiaoping. And to be fair, some of these policies, I would argue, are progressive from the standpoint of, if you look at the founding fathers of globalization, Carl Polanyi, in his seminal piece of The Great Transformation, right? When you talk and you think about the commodification of labor, right? When you talk about the industrialization effort, there needs to be some basic guardrails around capitalism and markets. Otherwise, it just goes amok. I mean, markets, there needs to be some basic boundaries. That's where government needs to come in certain areas. And so from that standpoint, I think there are some legitimate boundaries and policies that President Xi is making that are legitimate and good for China's overall economy, particularly from a regulation standpoint. But overall, I think that the more concerning issue is that when you have an environment which is not, proactively encouraging innovation, diversity of thought, setting term limits where you essentially are elected for life, you are creating a very, very precarious situation in future where people are going to be vying for power, and there will be a power vacuum when she passes away. And we do not know how that will play out with China's overall social, political, and economic system. And so that's setting a very, very dangerous precedent that I think a lot of countries are concerned about.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thanks for the question, Aisha.
It's really interesting to hear you say that, and again, you're vastly more familiar with this topic than I am. I mean, but I do think that this, going to Asha's question, this notion of history, informing how Chinese leadership thinks. I mean, there is one narrative, and I'm curious what you make of this narrative, Earl. I mean, this is a narrative that you see a lot, that China will say. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, China enjoyed a far more significant degree of centrality in the global economy and world affairs. And so, China is several millennia old. The United States is approximately 2.5 centuries old. And so if you look at sort of from the Industrial Revolution onwards, compared to sort of America's time horizon versus the post-industrial revolution period, as a proportion of China's history. So China says, well, the post-industrial revolution period, from Beijing's perspective, it's not the norm, it's an aberration. And so China says, we're not disrupting, with our resurgence, we're not disrupting world affairs, we're simply restoring world affairs to a kind of equilibrium that existed for the better part of, for the better part of multiple millennia. How important a role do you think that this kind of post-industrial revolution narrative, this notion that sort of the past 200 years or so, two and a half centuries, that period has been aberrant. How large a role does that kind of demarcation play in informing China's sort of current time horizons, how it thinks about the international system, how it thinks about where it wants to go? But it kind of gets to Asha's question again about sort of the role of history. But does that narrative, in your conversations, does that narrative come up?
Absolutely, and I think it's part and parcel of what President Xi calls this rejuvenation of China's place in the world, as well as rejuvenation of the China dream. I think when you look at China has a vast and very proud history of 5,000 plus years, and when you look at a good portion of that history, it's marred with certain blemishes with respect to colonialism, with respect to how Hong Kong was essentially, under the British system, British colonial system. There's this kind of, legacy in history that, when China thinks about it, it says, that's a part of history that we're not particularly proud of, and in many ways ashamed of. And so within this rejuvenation, it's almost this notion of, this is how we right the wrongs of the past in many ways. This is how we illustrate our ability to redefine a Chinese dream that redefines how we think of history, but sets China apart of how the world should look at China. And so, history will always be a critical part of how China is redefining itself. But I think also more importantly is this notion of when we see what China wants and aspires to be going forward, and it gets back to, Ali, something you said, redefining the rules and the systems, just looking at 5G fiber optic cables and how that is laid out in developing economies in Africa or Central America or the Caribbean. China wants to rewrite the rules, systems, and global norms of the 21st century. And I think that is what is driving a lot of their major current decisions now, as well as being able to export their model, this economic model, to other countries.
Let me actually, and again, I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So for folks, please, if you have questions, raise your hand virtually or put your questions in the chat, and I'll call on you as soon as I see you. But while we're waiting for some additional questions, I want to actually sort of follow up on this point that you just made. So this is, and I think that you've, in your remarks and in our conversation, you've broached this, but I want to kind of put the question sort of more explicitly. How important, sort of a two-part question. One, how important a role does ideology play in U.S.-China competition? So we hear a lot about military competition, economic competition, technological competition, and I think that those are all very important components of competition. They will continue to be. Is the competition between the United States and China? You mentioned earlier that it's going to sort of be anchored primarily in sort of a competition over sort of economics, over technology. But talk about the role of ideology. How central is ideology to this competition between the United States and China? Number one, and number two, you mentioned this notion of exporting the model. What is the China model? Is there a singular China model? Are there China models that are being exported? And how actively is China trying to promulgate and or export its model? So maybe talking just a little bit more about the ideological valence of the competition. How pronounced is it? And then is there a China model or models, and what are the core characteristics?
Yeah, I'll start with the model first, and then I'll go to ideology. I'm reminded when Chinese leaders visit countries, particularly in Africa, and many will remember the former leader of Zimbabwe, and who was had a very charismatic aura in the region. And when China's leaders would go and visit a number of these leaders throughout various African countries and would say, hey, we will provide these loans and economic assistance, and there is no such thing as conditionality with respect to human rights. What is often shoved down your throats with respect to what the World Bank and IMF says. I mean, these African leaders are saying, look, you are speaking our language. I mean, this is what we've been wanting to hear for quite some time. And when China can also frame it within the context of a South to South movement, we were not colonized. We share this kind of common history and heritage from the South to South movement. This really resonates with a lot of leaders and people within the continent of Africa and other developing economies. And so this economic model or models, which, if you will, is really predicated on this notion of, let's focus more on the economics, right? Let's focus more on providing economic financing and assistance to build infrastructure, and hence, the critical importance of institutions like the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the Silk Road Bank, and others that play a critical role in fundamentally redesigning the infrastructure in these countries that are so badly needed. And there's not talk about the values piece, right? There's not talk about human rights or elsewhere. So I think that is one critical model or aspect of a model that really resonates with people and leaders in the developing world. Number one, in terms of ideology, I'll kind of link ideology with kind of values. And I think that, when I lived in China, there was this talk of values and ideology. For President Jiang Zemin, his ideological point was something in Chinese that was called the Sangge Daibiao, the three represents, and each Hu Jintao had his ideology as well. But the reality is that if you ask the common people, what do these ideologies really mean? When I talk to the taxi drivers and we have great conversations, they're like, I can't really describe it. It doesn't really mean anything to me. Like, if you were to ask them, what does the three represents mean to you, and how does that impact your family and your kids? They probably wouldn't be able to respond or answer that accurately, right? And you see how other things, like just looking at religion, for example, the underground church movement in China was taking off in a way that was just amazing. And in part because the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party was not really gravitating. It wasn't really impacting, or there wasn't a receptivity towards it. And other things were filling that void, such as religion and elsewhere, particularly in underground churches. And so I think that the Chinese Communist Party is facing, in many ways, when President Xi assumed power, was trying to revitalize that ideological component, which in many ways was not, impacting people in a tangible way that they can really understand it. In terms of the values piece, the value system is what will really separate and what is really, causing a lot of tension between the Western world and China. We have fundamental different values, or how we calibrate and look at these values are very different. I'll give just one example to illustrate this point. I was speaking to a friend, and they were telling me that a Chinese had contacted them to write a report. And so the person says, yeah, we're in the business of writing reports and would be happy to do that. And so they were writing a report about semiconductors. And then the Chinese client said, well, listen, this is great. It's just we need some more like insider information that can really help us better understand the deal. And so the American counterpart said, well, do you understand that what you are asking me to do and provide you in the United States is actually illegal, aka it's something called insider trading, and I could get locked up and go to jail. But from the Chinese perspective, they were like, hey, this is what we call in Chinese 内部消息. It's called inside info, and it's like juicy, it's gossipy. It's like the stuff that we live for. It's like the stuff that's like really, it's the stuff that we want. But this is where we calibrate and have to understand the difference in values and systems between China and the U.S. And just sharing that anecdote on a civil society level. Just think about the implications of that from a senior level.
this is something I really, just have appreciated about this conversation, and I wish that actually I like the way that you intersperse kind of personal stories and vignettes with kind of your broader geopolitical analysis, and I think that too often you find individuals who they do a lot of kind of the 30,000-foot geopolitical analysis, but it feels a bit detached from kind of day-to-day realities. And then sometimes you have individuals who, they have a lot of compelling anecdotes, but perhaps they sort of extrapolate too much from sort of their vignettes. But I really like the way that you intersperse, really, really compelling stories and vignettes with geopolitical insights. We're coming up on time. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure, since Asha really generously brought us together to discuss your book. And I want to make sure that obviously folks on the call get the book, read the book. It's really, really important, really timely, really illuminating. I think a very, very important contribution to the literature on U.S. policy towards China. So,
thank you.
Of course. I mean, what are the themes that you want us to take away? What messages should we take away? What themes should we take away? And maybe kind of as a second question, in the course of assembling the material for the book, any sort of lessons or insights that sort of came as a surprise to you? Anything that kind of sort of any perceptions that you sort of held prior to writing this book that you now are revisiting? So tell us a little bit about what we should learn. What are the big takeaways, and what were some of the big surprises in terms of preparing the book?
Great. No, thank you. So one of the first persons who bought my book was a 4-foot, 9-inch woman. Her name is Jan. Jan is my next door neighbor, and she grew up in Nebraska. Now, Jan has never been to China ever. And I would meet Jan in the hallway. We would talk about like her grandkids, and then we would talk about things that I'm passionate about. And obviously I would, somehow China would come up in our conversation. And she would say to me, Earl, you talk a lot about China, and I hear so much about China in the media, in the news, and I don't know what to believe. And so Jan was one of the first people who bought my book outside of my mama. Mama was first. And she read it, and as she was reading it, she said, Earl, there's a lot of this that is like way over my head in many different ways, but I want to continue reading it because I want to get a more informed view about China, because I feel people like me grew up in Nebraska, don't really know a lot about China, and we should. And if I can inspire people like Jan to learn more about and have a more informed view about China, I think this book has served its purpose. One of my goals is to have this book in every single library in the United States. And for those on the call, if you can have your local librarian, they have a budget for new books. It's something that I'm really passionate about, because we've got to get this relationship right, not just for my kids who are age 13 and 11, but for my grandkids, for my great grandkids, and for all of you, your kids, your great grandkids. I think it's so critically important that we have a more nuanced and nuanced perspective on China. And if you look at ordinary Chinese citizens, both at a high school level, middle school level, college level, they have an understanding of the world that is far more nuanced and far more informed than I would say their peers in the United States or other countries. And so I think if we can foster this level of knowledge augmentation, particularly in the United States around countries like China, I think it would be a huge service for our future generations. So that was one question. And then the other question about lessons learned, I think for me, I would write this book from about 11 o'clock. I had a little routine after the kids went to bed. After I did the dishes, I'd write from 11 o'clock at night till about 2 in-the-morning, and then, go to work the next day. And when you do that for several months, you essentially get burnt out. It's a really, really challenging, but also at the same time, very meaningful process. And I think that what I took away from this is that I hope that, at one point in life, my grandchild or my great grandchildren, when they read this book and they see how passionate I am about, U.S. and China relations and forming a critical bridge between the cultures, I hope that it inspires both them and other people to be a bridge between countries.
I mean, Earl, I can't think of a better way to conclude. And I really, again, I've learned so much. I've taken so many pages of notes, but I think that you really, just in a short amount of time, have not only given us a really rich, textured, nuanced view of the U.S.-China relationship, but again, drawing on your own origin story, drawing on interactions with your friends and neighbors and colleagues, have really have used those vignettes to give texture to your analysis. And I think that this has been a real tour de force. And certainly, who could quibble with your conclusion that the United States and China, they inevitably will have competitive, even adversarial dynamics of the relationship. But I think that the inevitability of competition should not and need not preclude the imperative of cooperation and cohabitation. And I think that we have to figure, as you said, we have to figure out a way to get on with one another. We have to figure out a way to coexist. And I think that will be the task for folks on this call, for folks, for leaders in the United States, for leaders in China. That will be a multi-generational ongoing task. I want to say, thank you. Thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom. Congratulations again on the book. And I really encourage all of you on the call to read it. It's a very important book, a very critical contribution on a very critical subject. So, with that, Asha, why don't I want to continue to pass the floor back to you, and just to say again, thank you to. I do want to say just about Asha. Asha, not only for everyone on this call, but for me personally, for so many years you've been a generous friend, a generous mentor, someone I every day look up to in terms of how to, live a good life, to be a public servant, to be a citizen, to be an analyst. You really are a role model for myself and for countless others. And with DINS, a real shout out to DINS and Asha, what you and your colleagues have set up. It is now a powerhouse in the national security and foreign policy ecosystem in our nation. It is lifting up voices from across generations, from across backgrounds, from across religious communities, ethnic communities. It really has made our nation's ecosystem for foreign policy and national security discourse so much more vibrant. So really just hats off to you, Asha. So thank you, for being a mentor, a friend to so many of us. Thank you for everything you're doing with DINS. And just thank you for giving Earl and myself the chance to share a few thoughts. And Asha, why don't I pass the floor back to you?
Thank you, Ali. It was really, I appreciate that, especially about the mentorship. I look up to you and Earl as well, as far as being sharper and sharper in my analysis when it comes to the international relations. And you guys are spot on as far as being able to feed the priority when it comes to looking at U.S.-China relations. But I would also, I have to end it here, where this has been done by DINSN and Robert Alexander and them, who have coordinated 100% on this. I can't take full credit, but all I could say is that I'm really into making sure that everybody has a voice, and that, as I'm serving DINSN, is on their own, helping to push out and continue the legacy that I helped build out. So thank you so much. And I'll now pass on to DINSN.
Okay, it's Sherry again, and I'd like to say excellent panel. Thank you, Mr. Carr and Ali, for the wonderful exchange. We really enjoyed it. And again, on behalf of Robert and myself and DINSN, thank you so much, and have a beautiful evening. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.